Red alert! Red alert! Andy is coming upstairs!
Hey everyone, Plastic Commander here. I'm real glad you came to join me today, here in the Commander Corner. Makes me real happy, you know. You could have clicked on any video. There's millions of them, but you chose mine, and you know what? That just makes me so full of joy. So, without further ado, let's jump into today's topic.
Are toy army men racist?
That's right. I'm gonna ask them myself. Are you racist? These little guys have been around since the 50s. You know what else was in the 50s? Racism. That's right. Racism.
Racist.
These guys have been around forever, and I think I finally found, after years of searching, the most racist toy army dude. And I'm gonna sit him down, and we're gonna have a one-on-one conversation about hatred, okay? Because you know what? Racism, despite what some of you may think, is not cool. And you can feel free to quote me on that. Racism isn't funny either. Name me one thing that's racist and also funny. Nothing. There's no such thing. I Googled it. And Google doesn't lie. So today, we're going to be looking at why toy army men are racist.
So, today's topic is really going to be about the history of toy army men colors. Where do green and tan army men come from? Who started making them that way? And when did we start doing it? So, to jump right in, let's go all the way back in time to the 1950s. So in the 1950s, pretty much everyone who produced plastic toy army men and toy soldiers in general would just make a single set of soldiers. Earlier in history, most sets of toy soldiers you got, it would come with just a few, and they would all be different, and it wasn't like you got any bad guys to fight. And it was the same in the 50s. MPC, Lido, the companies making green plastic army men made them and sold them just in bags, just in a bag of green army men. So, and Marx did the same thing. Some of Marx's first ever army men they sold were just green army dudes in a bag. So, then in the 1960s, Marx began releasing a series of playsets called Battlegrounds. And the Marx Battlegrounds line did phenomenally well, primarily because they had two sides opposing each other. The first few ones would be called Battleground Europe, and they would primarily be between the Germans and the Americans. And these sets went crazy because now kids finally had a bad guy to fight. And if you saw some of my earlier videos, we talk a lot about how back in the day, kids growing up at this time just completely idolize the heroes of the Second World War. So tons of toy companies were making toys based off the conflict. Of course, greens were Americans, for back then, American soldiers wore olive drab green uniforms. Germans, of course, whether it was the Volkssturm, the SS, or even the Wehrmacht, would wear gray uniforms, so of course they're gray. Japanese guys, they made yellow.
That's racist!
They made the Japanese yellow. And the video is primarily going to focus on this set of Japanese soldiers here. But yeah, he made the Japanese soldiers yellow. And you can make a lot of jokes about that. And of course, it wasn't just because, you know, they thought it was funny, because people back then were very racist. In fact, this is a reproduction Marx Japanese soldier. This is a vintage. So the vintage ones are actually way more mustardy and way more yellow. These are the ones that Marx produced, and if it focuses, oh well, focusing in and out. So they made the Japanese soldiers yellow. And the reason this is so funny to me is because what are the two primary colors for Army men? Think about it. You don't have to think hard. In the Army men video games, it's green versus tan. Tan and green Army men have been the rivals for decades. And then when other companies started making their Army men in different colors, they started making them in green and tan, like Tim E. and their famous 32 millimeter Vietnam era soldiers. Those soldiers that they sold were primarily in green and tan. So the reason tan Army men exist is because of the Japanese guys. Because at Glencoe Marks, they thought it would be funny to make the Japanese guys yellow. And of course, when these are made today, they're made in a much more tan color. So, but back then, here's another vintage one on the table. Way more yellow. So, yeah, tan Army men are a thing because Marx thought it would be funny to make the Japanese guys yellow.
As funny as it is to go ahead and play the racist card, it is important to note that the reason these colors were primarily picked was because those were just the colors of the uniforms. The German Wehrmacht wore gray, the American Army wore olive drab, and the Japanese IPA uniform was tan for most regions and ranks. So, again, not saying they're off the hook, because a part of this was because they thought it would be funny. That's why the older figures have that more yellow color. But it is important to also consider that the reason these colors were primarily picked was because it was consistent with the rest of the figures being representations of the armies they were portraying. That being said, you're about to see that Marx isn't off the hook yet. Oh no.
And it is very important to actually also point out is that Marx produced these figures in multiple colors actually, and they actually color swapped them. Here's a American GI from a Marx Battlegrounds. This is a reproduction. And this is also a reproduction, but this is a Japanese soldier that's a more lime, lighter color green. They did actually swap these colors around from time to time in their play sets. However, actual vintage ones of these are pretty hard to come across because those were just not produced as much as the original Japanese tan green American soldier play sets. So anywho, let's actually look at the figures themselves. So, are the figures themselves, aside from their color, particularly offensive? Yeah, the actual faces of the figures, not all of them are bad. I'm going to be honest, not all of them, are bad. However, and I asked my friends this as well, what they thought, and they were like, okay, some of these are kind of bad. Look at this guy. Oh, my Lord. But, not all of them are. Not every single one of these guys is, downright offensively terrible. And also, while I have them on the table, here is a 6-inch vintage Marx Japanese soldier. Yeah, that's... And again, this one's a little more orangey than his 3-inch counterpart. But this is a vintage 6-inch millimeter, and yeah, these, these figures are not, I don't see these being able to pass through today's standards at all, of course, and they can be a little bit out there. This guy especially, because if you look close enough, you can kind of see buck teeth. Oh my lord. But yeah, these figures...
Holy fish paste!
That's a little spicy. I think I'm going to have to wash that down with a nice, refreshing Capri Sun.
Look at this guy. Just take a look at him. Okay, if you were looking at those previous figures of like Clay, you're full of it. You are full of liberal SJW, BBC, BBW, SSBBW bullcrap. Look at this guy. Well, the first thing you learn in art class, and I'm no artist, but the first thing they teach you in art class is that everything has to be drawn. Everything has to be designed before it is made. Someone sat down and drew this guy, took it to a room full of people who were all probably old racist white men. It was like, here's our designs for the new Mark's Battlegrounds line versus Japan, and they saw this guy and they were like, this is the funniest thing I've ever seen. I mean, look at him. As if the glasses weren't enough, the guy gave him a pair of buck teeth. Like, this is literally a stereotypical caricature from the 40s if I've ever seen one. And this is, without a doubt, the most offensive toy army dude I've ever seen. And there's really none. Really, if you look at these guys, most of them are so low detailed, especially knockoffs, that you can't even make out any sort of a face. But this guy, look at him. I can't get over the guy drew in buck teeth.
It's your teeth, Reggie. I don't know whether to smile at you or kick a field goal, man.
This is something out of one of those Looney Tunes cartoons that got Bugs Bunny canceled on Twitter from the 40s. That's what this is. This is, without a doubt, the most offensive toy army dude in my collection.
So, there you have it. Perhaps the most offensive toy army dude there is. So, are army men racist? No. Of course not. Let's be serious now. They're not racist. So before you go canceling army men, because the king of army men himself told you they were racist, just remember that that one guy is one out of a bajillion different toy army dudes. And that it was made at a time where that was acceptable. A time that we have come far away from. So if I do find any more figures that stand out, which has been really hard, I wanted to do more figures for this series, this episode. However, it's been fairly difficult because there just aren't a lot that were particularly offensive. So, yeah, army men really are not racist. So anyway, guys, you saw nothing. So anyway, guys, make sure to hit that subscribe button, hit notifications, get those turned on so you know when the Plastic Commander is kicking your door in. I'm coming for you next. You know who you are. I know who you are. Quit toying with me. It's not funny anymore.
Mission accomplished. Well done, men. Pack it up. We're going home.